There we go. So as you can see, based off of what we just discussed, um, can give you sufficient insight relative to uh, the dialectical model that we so choose to use. And again, to reiterate some of the reading that we had, is these models assume that social life has an inherent stress or contradiction that develop because all social developments, even successful ones, taken to their ultimate conclusion, carry with them seeds of their own destruction. So as long as these young people, this target audience that we are identifying in the process, is willing to take on that self-tax, uh, there's hope. And my immediate observation, based off the communities that I've worked with, there is a lot of hope because there are a lot of young people starting to take that ownership role of their tribe and their community. So that's some hope there. Next, we're going to focus on the theory of social change, the theory perspective. So the functionalist position best describes, in my opinion, the current situation associated with any rural or even tribe in general, but in any rural tribe. Their inherent strains within their system of government and community development are, let me rephrase that, their inherent strains with their system of government and community development are prevalent, arguably rooted in the volatile nature that and inconsistent policy application imposed by the federal government via the congressional and judicial branches up until 1974. And even post 1974, there are still some challenges and still some issues that tribes face that set precedents through the legal system, through the judicial branch. Some great wins and some not so great wins or losses, I should say. Let me get back here. It's a little late. I've been working, so I'm trying to gain my focus. Bear with me. So to analyze this, a suitable framework described within mass society theory will enable us to better identify the social strains associated with tribes in the face of becoming self-determinant within the confines of restricted land base. They're often landlocked, along with the fact that these sovereign nations are required to jump through more bureaucratic hoops in their efforts to develop versus the minimal hoops required by neighboring municipalities or states for that matter. Although tribes are recognized as sovereign nations, the line between the government to government relationship is quite blurry, as you can see from what I previously explained. The precedent set in tribal relations was rooted in treaties, and as the U.S. began to seek out more land and resources, the congressional and judicial branches muddied the waters, eventually doing away with treaties as the U.S. began to occupy western coastal cities, or I'm sorry, societies, to include Alaska and Hawaii. Over the course of the past 200 years, the judicial branch and developing court cases seem to be the premise in which Congress would heed their decision versus digging into the archives of treaties and the obligations set forth in those treaties. This 200-year history of Indian law and policy set the stage for uncertainty for many tribal societies. Yet, through this adversity, tribes, tribal people, indigenous people continue to prosper and adapt with each sharp turn. In 1974, after the passing of the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act, the outlook became brighter. However, with only 44 years into the process, Congress will still undermine at times or undercut funding support and or deadlock development efforts. Tribes tend to seek in their journey towards self-determination these efforts and roll with the punches and continue to push through. Part of the undermining efforts may be due to Congress's ignorance in understanding the history of their own country. However, that ignorance becomes a fault once they are educated and still choose to ignore the obligations that this country has to their indigenous people. So this is where things start to become a little bit complex because there's a number of dynamics that are considered when we're looking at various origins of the social change. You know, as we were discussing the dialectical model. There was mention of relative deprivation. Um, but to move forward, uh, tribal self-determination delves into, at various levels and capacities, um, all three vehicles of social change, i.e., social movements, revolution, um, and social networks and innovation. U.S. federally recognized tribal nations and their citizens or their members are burdened with the weight associated with their social reality via its historically inconsistent relationship with the three branches of our federal government. Um, they are not just frequently, but continually and tirelessly dealing with the nuances of re-educating delegates in Congress to assert their rights. On behalf of their citizens work, but they work in between the lines on a micro and macro scale. Um, for simplification of this particular task of identifying um, the um, forgive me, for this particular task of identifying the um, types of social movement, um, we're going to have to simplify this because um, you can't have um, all the pieces or one piece and expect the vehicle to move. So we're going to we'll frame the vehicles of social change within the context of social movements. In breaking down the type of social movements, we must consider identifying and construct the constructs of the vehicle and its parts. There are a couple of types within the 6 types of movements illustrated in our social movement document, which are applicable to rural tribal communities. Not mentioning them would leave the task inoperable in an inoperable state, such as an engine without a frame and wheels, or a frame without an engine and wheels intact, but no electrical system. The vehicle won't move. However, for this particular illustration, we are going to be specific to reform versus revolutionary, and this will be the ideal type or frame in which we would house some of the other types, or shall I say, parts which would initiate movement of the vehicle. So this is where it gets a little complex, at least from my observation. Um, in tribal communities, you have at one end of the spectrum um, total reformists, and at the other end of the spectrum, you have revolutionary type social movement groups within tribal communities. And then right in the middle, I refer to it, a term that I coined in our business is transitionary. Or a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine, Dr. Pearl Yellowman, identifies that sweet spot as the spot of translation. And in any part of engagement within a tribal community to encourage and or influence social change, that sweet spot is the area which will influence that change and probably the most difficult area in which to work. So here's a little bit of an illustration to give you. You can kind of see that here and take a quick look. On the reform side, you got various groups, and this is just a small sample of groups that are on the reform side of the spectrum. You got the Native American Financial Officers Association, the National Indian Gaming Association, the Self-Governance Communication and Education Program. And these are wonderful, wonderful educational-based and training support-based programs to assist tribes in reformation and or adopting ways to continue to develop their societies. And on the revolutionary side, you got grassroots activist groups, anti-capitalists, and up to and including anarchists. And then right in the middle, you have these groups that embrace the culture, but realize that they need to make some adaptive changes, but at least do not want to sacrifice the integrity of who they are as a people. And groups like that would be National Congress of American Indians, on a local level here in Arizona, Intertribal Council of Arizona, Then you have some business groups out there that are putting together efforts to reform or transition per se. So hopefully that gives you somewhat of an idea, or at least a snapshot of what we're dealing with. But the change is going to occur right in that middle piece, that transitionary piece. And it's an interdisciplinary approach. And the best example I can give is if you work for my wife, she works in healthcare, specifically in birthing. And then to be even more specific, in breastfeeding. She's one of, I believe, 11 or 12 indigenous IBCLC's, International Board Certified Lactation Consultants. But what she's trying to do is work in that sweet spot, take the knowledge from a clinical standpoint, Western medicine, and then everything that she's learned to earn her international accreditation. But at the same token, transition it into a way where she can go to each community and embrace their culture and utilize the best practices from Western medicine without compromising the integrity of cultural birthright processes. With me in insurance and in risk management, doing the same thing, designing a template that third-party providers need to fit, and that template is within the constructs or confines of the tribal culture, versus the tribe trying to fit a template that's not all that amiable. In essence, practicing sovereignty. There are a number of groups, as I mentioned earlier, and each are serving a similar purpose, but not always seeing eye to eye. A reforming body may indeed, and in contrast to a prototypical social movement vehicle, may seek external rewards to include money and assets, often under the guise of tribal economic development. This type of activity may or may not involve natural resources and or structural development. Reformers may get pushback from revolutionaries, land protectors, water protectors, on such matters, who do not identify with the capitalist perspective or resource extraction, destroying the earth as a mean to sustain a society or people. The origins of social movements are rooted in nearly 400 years of forced and coerced dispossession of lands and rights. If we take a contemporary lens, it may look something like these comparative SWOT analyses, and this is why it's this social change or this social change process is quite different, because we're dealing with various dynamics and control mechanisms. So let me give you, hopefully you'll be able to see these two different SWOT analyses and be able to make a cross comparison on where they're actually conflicting. And this is the type of dynamic that tribal governments have to often work with. So here you go. So over here, we have the white Euro possessive SWOT analysis. And then over here, we have the indigenous interests. And just kind of, for a second, identify where there's weaknesses, which I'll explain. So a strength of white Euro possessive would be microstructural mobilization context, relative deprivation, and a strength for an indigenous interest would be also microstructural mobilization context, and then Smelzner's value-added theory. A weakness for white possessive or white Euro possessive would be disassociation from historical truths. A weakness for indigenous interests would be very little congressional representation or advocacy. An opportunity for the Euro possessive would be status strains, Smelzner's value-added theory, targeting revolutionaries. That would be an opportunity for them, trying to discredit those revolutionaries because of some of the activity that may be deemed radical or threatening to society. Opportunities for indigenous interests would be conflict perspectives, and continued to educate reformers to try to fit into that middle spot that we talked about. Threats for Euro-possessive would be conflict perspectives and reformers, while threats for indigenous interests would be relative deprivation and status strains. So note and contrast, as in this example of comparing the opportunities and threats of each group. Disseminating and acknowledging these differences may be a stepping stone towards change. However, indigenous people are in a long-standing battle, kind of like the Spartans in Thermopylae. The only difference is they are born of this earth, hence there is a succession of new generations of indigenous youth with the reemergence of culture and knowledge who are now becoming fit for battle. So as mentioned earlier, there were some statistics as far as our target range. We are looking. Here I go with we. I would identify the ideal target range for this social change to be the younger population. I've had the opportunity to engage in various workshops and trainings between both populations on a professional level, and then on a nonprofit, community service-based level, work with young Native youth. So kind of scaling it down to two populations specifically. The population ranging between the ages of 46 to 65 were likely integrated in a system-based practice, introduced and or fostered through bureaucratic relations controlled by the trustee, who is also the trustor, in their oversight via various agencies, whether it's FBI, BIA, DOI, BOR. So all these acronyms, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of Interior, Bureau of Reclamation, etc. Many members of this group currently serve in leadership and or in a decision-making role for a tribal community, and they're rooted in some of these systemic-based practices that were fostered through the training and support services or mandates set by these particular departments. The population between 26 to 45 who have had an opportunity over the past 30 years to seek out their education and or vocational training. They're competent with technological advances, and they possess the knowledge to access information with a few keystrokes. That population is kind of in that transitionary space to a degree, but have yet to harness and or master that transitionary model per se, because there really isn't one in existence yet. And I call it micro-transitionary because every sector, whether you're working in workforce development, whether you're in environmental protection, whether you're in forestry, whether you're in health and human services, whether you're in transportation, the micro-transitionary component applies, and that's why it's an interdisciplinary approach to social change. The challenge is getting these two target groups first to identify their behavior, Second is to work through the differences in their attitudes, then synchronize their efforts in such a change. The older target population identified, they're accustomed to an obedience of systems, while the younger target population, in contrast, are willing to create new systems or revise existing systems, take risks and test limitations, but they're often stymied due to the humble nature of the kinship relationship, because often that relationship inserts itself when decisions are being made. And so often the younger generation will yield to the older generation. And so we have to figure out ways to respectfully challenge those practices. Synthesis of facilitative and re-educative strategies, recognizing that federal trust relationship lives in the realm of uncertainty. Subject to volatile political climates or special interests, one would think a tribal community would have a sense of urgency, and many do, Identifying the term self-determination is a code word for self-help. And at some point, the federal government may begin to, as they've done in the past, and sometimes show current signs of doing so now, identify means to access the natural resources or material assets, as they would call them, hidden away through many tribal trust lands. Um, they will likely at some point rationalize away their obligation to ensure that they, meaning the U.S. federal government, could possibly rationalize away their obligation, ensuring that trust responsibility. Um, there's been dispossession in the past, doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to happen in the future. So the time for change is being called upon. There's no doubt that disposition of lands, resources, family, and faith are indeed historically traumatizing and arguably one of the, if not the primary causation for poverty-stricken societies in Indian country or on Indian reservations. Tribes continually strive to improve their communities in developing their own programmatic endeavors, promoting and or reemerging language, culture, education, commerce, and self-determination. The threat is historically precedent in an ongoing frequent changes of Indian law and policy, and tribes can only continue to advocate with their congressional delegation the need to continually support and sustain, if not strengthen, the existing self-determination policies set forth 44 years ago. Over the course of the past 2 or 3 decades, tribes have initiated effort to re-educate in reintroducing language and culture, to establish their own schools and community colleges, to diversify their economies and partner with local municipalities and counties in this developing shared economy. It's time to continue the efforts in engaging the partners who will carry out the tasks of capacity building, i.e. small businesses that are micro-transitionary, interdisciplinary approaches, working in that sweet spot mentioned earlier, and willing to commit and invest the time, talent, and treasure in tribal communities, i.e. that self-tax. Community partners include vendors, service providers, government, local, state, national, and grassroots community members who seek to engage in this behavioral remodeling with one another. So in summary, we've taken a functionalist approach to viewing the means to initiate a social movement or change process within a tribal community, to focus on ownership of what it means to be truly self-determinant. The factors that we illustrated were twofold. The materialist factors that are imposed upon tribes by settler colonialism or the federal government in that case, and then the idealistic factors which tribes are doing their best effort to preserve, being that connection to land, identifying that resources are not material, and then coming to terms with that collectively as a whole, because within the community you have a lot of members that might see otherwise because they've been assimilated per se to the Western ideology, hence more material. The model of change is dialectical, and the theory perspective that we provided was mass society theory. The description of origin was a dispossession of their way of life. There were a number of attributes to that. Relative deprivation is another. And then the tasks to change would be to foster an initiative to educate the various level of ages with an emphasis to put an interest collectively with the elders and those that range in the Middle Ages to identify that, hey, we have to ensure sovereignty for the executors to our trust, which is that younger generation and those that are yet to be born. And if the community in whole can take a lens and look at the fact that, hey, we are a sovereign, and we do have an opponent, an opponent and ally in one, and that's the federal government. They're our ally, but at the same token, they're an opponent, because there are certain interests that they may want to attempt to capitalize on at the expense of indigenous people. It's historically precedent. Our lives are short. We're lucky to live 80, 90 years. And things can happen within that lifetime or immediately after. So the work is an ongoing process. It's going to be a change process that is not overnight, that is not 5 years, it's not 10 years. It's going to be a generational change process. Thank you and have a wonderful day.